Yeah, that's a great question. So a bit about me: Canadian, born in the U.S. but raised in Canada. Taiwanese immigrant parents. Lived in Asia here for a couple of years after college, but then I moved to the U.S. in San Francisco in '99. So I've been here almost 25 years. So did the startup thing. Was early at a startup that raised about $63 million in e-commerce. I ran online marketing for them. The business imploded. Then I was very fortunate to join Yahoo back in 2001. So I was an engineer. I was actually always on the business side, the sales and marketing, and I ended up running. I expanded Yahoo to about 45 different countries during my time there. So I spent 10 and a half years there. We met after I left Yahoo, so I took 2 years off doing the angel investing and boards. That's when we first met. I think it's 2012, probably that's right, 2012. And then after that, I was very lucky to I joined 500 startups. So I started the San Francisco office for 500 startups, and so I helped run Fund 3 and Fund 4 and ran the core accelerator program for about 6 years. Left in end of 2019, and so I ended up joining and running a gaming holding company based between Germany, LA, and Ukraine. Did that for about 2 years. So we had about 18 companies, like all like gaming studios and gaming IP licensing and everything related with gaming. So that was super interesting. Going back to operating, and while I was doing that, I started two things. I started joining a bunch of investment committees of different VC funds, and I started my own small VC fund. It's a rolling fund called Diaspora. So we've been fortunate to co-invest on a bunch of deals. And I've also been doing investments in LP checks out of a holding company that I run with my partner from Saudi Arabia called Sukna Holdings. And so I do a bunch of different things, right? So I don't run the gaming holding company now. I rolled off, unfortunately, after the Russians invaded Ukraine, because it's hard to run a company for San Francisco and most of the team being in Ukraine. But now I mainly invest full time. So whether through my holding company or through through Diaspora Ventures, which is a pre-seed fund that focuses on European founders focusing on the U.S. market. So it's very specific. So yeah, that's kind
I
of
mean,
the random story, right? Like random sort of like background.
so having been in Silicon Valley for many years now,
Yeah.
you have seen behind the curtain of the tech industry, hype and startup world.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what is the dark side of Silicon Valley that rarely get discussed openly?
Hmm. Well, I mean, so many of them. I mean, the success stories of just like all the success stories get cleaned up. So there's like, and also I think the dark side, it just sort of like everyone seems to think it's easier than it really is. And so you hear these stories where it's like, oh, they did this, and all of a sudden they raised like $1 billion, and now they're like this crazy sort of like huge company, without understanding that, well, they worked on this for like 4 or 5 years prior to this. They had a whole bunch of pivots, a bunch of co-founders like dropped out. Like there's always a long, painful backstory that isn't always sort of like obvious. And so I think there's that. I think that it's such a it's a very brutal culture, because it's just really hard. Like everyone hears about the success stories, but you don't hear about like the 90% of 95% of companies that don't make it, of founders who tried working on a business that end up going nowhere. They're divorced, massive debt. Like just like you don't hear about that part, right? So like it's a really hard journey. And it's never been easy, right? Like fundraising has never been easy. Maybe it seemed like it was easy in 2020 and 2021, but like it's never been easy. It's never been easy.
I mean, uh, does the VC industry have a close inner circle, and do they accept outsiders, immigrants, or minorities? Have you experienced or heard of any these kinds of groups among investors?
Yeah, I mean, let me think about that. I mean, not really. I think like you'll find that in Silicon Valley is pretty open minded in general, where it's like ultimately they don't really care where you come from. It's just like, are you good at what you do, right? Like, are you really are you working on something that's super interesting, and are you credible to sort of like do this, right? Because if you think about it, like what 50% of the most successful companies here in Silicon Valley like are either immigrants, started by immigrants, or started by children of immigrants. And so it's a fairly open culture in general about that, but you kind of have to understand the rules of how stuff works. You got to be able to present pretty well. Like there's certain things of just like there's a like every it's fairly open minded. So I don't know if that's the case. At least that's not necessarily been my experience.
And do you think that VC industry is also Ivy League, white men,
Not necessarily.
or
I mean, so many of the upcoming funds, like most of the major funds here, have like they're all a lot of them are minorities, right? Like Indian, Chinese. There's we're starting to see a lot of like female run sort of like VC funds. There's a bunch of them now. Some of the most impressive like new emerging fund managers are like female VCs. So I think that this the industry's changed a lot. So yes, so you still have a lot of Ivy Leaguers and things, but a lot of them are being washed out, to be frank, right? Like they aren't always the best ones and they don't always do well. I think there's an element of it is an outsider business and it gets refreshed all the time.
if you had the experience you have now,
Yeah.
but 10 years earlier in your life and
Yeah.
career,
Yeah.
what would you do differently in terms of life balance and also family life? What
Huh.
should you do differently?
I mean, the reality is, I don't think like I think a lot about this, right? As you know, I write and think about these things, and I'm like, I don't think I could be doing what I'm doing right now if I didn't do like go hardcore, right? Like, I have lots, I'm very open. I have a lot of family challenges because I never really invested on the family side, invested in my career, but I wouldn't have gotten here if I didn't do that. And so I don't know if there's anything like, I definitely think I definitely would have paid a lot more attention to family and prioritized a lot of that. That's way more important. Now I'm like learning that stuff the hard way. But career wise, I'm not sure I would have gotten to the point that I've gotten career wise if I didn't sacrifice. Like this is a hard, like for some reason is this idea that a lot of people believe like you can have it all. I don't believe that. I actually think like you have to make some hard choices, right? Like it's not like work-life balance. I don't believe in work-life balance. I believe in like work-life choices. And
I
so just
mean,
that's a
you
harsh truth of just like it. I think if I was a lot more thoughtful, I think I probably could have mitigated some of the issues and prioritized things a little bit differently. On the other hand, where I'm just like, yeah, but I probably wouldn't have learned the lesson. Like, I'm not sure I would have learned the lesson. Like, I feel like people only learn the hard way, and you learn the hard way by just making those mistakes. Unfortunately,
I have an idea and also would like to ask you about the family work life balance.
yeah,
What advice would you give to your daughter in a form of blog post, drawing from your own experiences? I was thinking to write my son and also daughter about some of my advices to them to read. They don't care now, but
yeah,
at some point they will read what I have written in the past.
yeah.
So, what should be your advice to your daughter?
I think, I think that this idea that you can take your 20s off, I think is a mistake. I think you should have fun, do those things that actually really matter, right? Because of the experience stuff. And I've really come around to this. Actually, I'd recommend that you read a book called it's called Die with Zero by like Bill Perkins. He's a hedge fund guy and poker player, like super interesting dude. Like there's sort of like seasons of your life. And I think sort of, I wish I had a little bit more fun during my 20s and not being as serious, where it's just like, I optimize sometimes the wrong thing. And so knowing what I know right now, I think I probably would have been a little bit more easygoing in during my 20s. Because I think I went too hardcore. I was very, very hardcore in my 20s where I just felt really, really behind. And so, for example, like I'm really glad I did the backpacking thing. A lot of my friends didn't do the backpacking thing. It just did career only. So I'm glad I did that. But I think the rest of my life, where I'm just like, it was all career. I literally just put like literally almost all my time and energy into career stuff. And I probably could have had a little bit more fun during that time. And I think there's a season to that. I was much younger back then, so I had a lot more energy and just tried other things, like taking up other hobbies that would have been probably made me a much more interesting person now.
Interesting. You studied history in the university. How do you think
Yeah.
that this background has added value to your journey as an investor?
I think it's been incredibly helpful. I think, understanding sort of like, especially I did a lot of like Chinese, Indian, European history, and I do a lot of business in Europe now. So you kind of understand a lot more of the cultures and the cultural norms and etiquette and things like that. Why people do the things that they do. It's surprisingly was actually very, very helpful, especially for a lot of my international expansion career. And so, yeah, it actually turned out to be way more helpful than I thought it would have been.
Uh-huh. I mean, you are traveling many countries and understand the roots of Silicon Valley deeply. In your opinion, what other countries often get wrong when trying to create their own startup ecosystems modeled after San Francisco and Silicon Valley?
I think they draw a lot of the wrong lesson from Silicon Valley, in the sense of just like, oh, like you need to like. I think Silicon Valley is like it's not a formula. I think it's very accidental, right? So, for example, like it's very accidental. Great weather, great universities. Also, the military industry, right? The defense industry was very strong here, so there was a lot of deep science and whatnot. I also think there's a bunch of things that also were sort of accidents. So, for example, non-compete. Also, a lot of the VC industry started off here too, right? Origin was in Boston, but I think the big part in Boston was that they had they enforced non-compete clauses, so it's very hard for somebody leaving a big company to start a company, right? Because they would get sued. That was not an issue over here. Plus the nice weather, the aggregation, just sort of like a also much more chill culture that's sort of like somewhat more friendly to sort of like engineering sort of like thinking. So there's a whole bunch of accidents that happened here, and so I think a lot of ecosystems kind of focus just on one thing, where it's like, okay, we're just going to go and fund a whole bunch of VC funds, and that's going to solve our problem, or we're going to go do this one major university and get some deep tech that comes out of here, and that's going to solve our problem. Where it's actually a whole bunch of different pieces coming together.
Mm. And what are the three biggest failures or mistakes you have made in your career as an investor, and what key lessons did you learn from them? Do you have
I
any
think the big
regrets?
um Yeah, I mean, I have lots of regrets, right? I think missing certain good deals because you're like, or for example, honestly, sort of like, doing a bunch of deals that would not be good deals. But I think you're like, maybe I'll give it a shot, and just so for example, like I think the biggest mistake that I made, like I did so many shitty deals in 2021. So I'm not supposed to swear, but I just did so many crappy deals in 2021 because I just got caught up in the excitement of just like, oh wow, like it's so busy, it's such a crazy time, or for example, like outsourcing my thinking of just like, oh, here's a bunch of awesome investors in this deal, like it must be a good deal, and not necessarily thinking for myself. I always get into trouble when that happens. And so the deals that I've always done the best in were deals that were like not super popular, right? Like deals that were let's just say non-consensus deals, right? Where it's like people didn't understand it. Most VCs hated it. Like the companies that actually had a hard time fundraising. Those deals have ultimately weren't just, but I'm just like, wow, like this is such an awesome company, such an awesome founder, such a huge opportunity. Like I just don't care. Like just having like acting on my conviction, those have turned out to be great deals versus the ones where it's just like, oh, like cutting corners on sort of like criteria. Every time I cut corners on my criteria that is pretty established now, always turns out to be a mistake. Or deals that are basically like as a consensus deal, so it's like, oh, a whole bunch of other investors in this deal, like I should go do that deal. They just never work out.
I understand. And what are the difficulties for challenges you face evaluating deals all over the world? Because you are getting lots of deal flow from different parts of the world. Are there any difficulties, especially not being focused on the same location?
No, not really. I mean, I guess for me, because I've just done so many international deals, and a lot of my winning companies, at least in my previous portfolio, were, for example, European. So like ManyChat was like Russian, Armenian, U.S. company, right? Like, Aircall was a French company. So like Pipefy was a Brazilian company. Like I had a whole bunch of really, really awesome companies that ultimately sort of like ended up here in the US. And so for me, I'm judging everybody sort of at the same sort of like standard. So I would say it's and because I'm so early, I'm investing at pre-seed and seed level. Like ultimately, there's sort of like people assessments, right? Versus sort of like, oh, like I can do diligence on customers. They have no customers, they have no users, they only have a product most of the time, and so it's just sort of ultimately they're bets on people.
So, are there any personality traits or types of founders you dislike working with? How can you quickly identify them in a brief startup meetings? Have you seen founders with difficult personalities end up changing for the better long term?
Very rarely. I think ultimately, right? Like the way I think about this is like obviously almost every founder I meet is super smart and driven, right? In general. For me, the biggest thing is just sort of like, are they like, do they really understand sort of like the problem? Do they really understand sort of like the customers that they're going after? That's one big part. Second big part is really like, how do these founders actually compare against sort of like my top 10 percentile of founders, right? The Oliviers from Aircall, the Lauras from Shippo, you go down the list of like, Alec from Trade Space, right? Like we're like, I've been a backer of Alec like many times, right? From 500 startups days all the way through to even like my Sukna holding company days, right? Or just like I put multiple checks into this company. Even when they, like they didn't raise a round, like their big round until like this year, right? Like, no, or not this year, it was like last year, 2023. But like, it took a long time, right? And so, but it's just like, this is just such an awesome founder with a huge opportunity. And so, but remember, it wasn't easy. And so just sort of, I compare people like founders against like that founder set. And every time I broke the rule, that deal has never worked out.
Uh, Tell about the rule and evaluation process and mindset. How do you select the startups?
Yeah, ultimately, sort of, so it depends on sort of, on the vehicle, right? So I have two vehicles, but I'm mainly investing out of diaspora right now, right? I'm not doing as much stuff out of my holding company, where it's mainly LP checks. But for diaspora, it's basically, either myself or my partner Carlos will look at a company. We'll talk to the company. If we think it's interesting, then we'll usually sort of like discuss it during our weekly IC, and then we'll refer that company to sort of like the other partner. The other partner will talk to the company, and then we'll kind of discuss where it's like, okay, do we move forward or not? How does this company look versus all the other deals and stuff that we're looking at right now? And the process could be in between 2 weeks to like 4 weeks, but it's pretty fast.
Do you have any red flags you look out when evaluating these potential investments or in the meetings?
So for diaspora, it's very specific. So because we're focusing on European pre-seed founders, focusing on the US market, most of the founders, we really want to make sure that they're going to move to the US. I think there are some exceptions where it's like, okay, if you're an open source developer tool, not as important. I think it's helpful to be out here, but like not as critical. But I think almost any other business where if you're not here in the US market, you just don't grow as quickly. I think, and there's a specific reason for this. We want them to be around other awesome founders. And if you actually, so for example, if you're like in the fintech space, you should be in New York. You probably should be in New York, right? Like the density of great US focused fintech founders is really high over there. So it's incredibly helpful to be around other great founders. They just move faster. I think if you're developer tools, or if you're like SaaS, B2B software, like you should be in Silicon Valley. There is no other market in the US that's sort of better than this place that you're going to run into other awesome, or even AI company, right? Like it's Silicon Valley. And so I just think there's this density. So that it's very helpful to be around other awesome founders. You just naturally grow faster and move much faster. It's really hard doing it. Not impossible, but really, really hard to do that from your home country. Your
You
network is
have.
your net worth, right?
So, do you think that the investment committees with 3 to 5 people work well for making outlier high alpha venture
I think it's
investments?
tougher.
Or
Yeah, I think it's tougher. I think those are really hard to do, but I think it does make sense at later stages. I think because like there's just so much more data you can discuss, right? It's very different for the stage that you and I invest in, which is like, early stage, pre-seed, seed, like there's nothing, there's no data. I think it's a very different beast, which I don't invest at later stage. So it's harder for me to understand. My guess is that for later stage, if you're doing series B, C, Ds, I think there's a lot more stuff to discuss. And I think that's not in, and you're writing bigger checks, right? You're writing 20 million, $50 million checks. I think that's valuable.
and you are
But
on the
yeah.
boards of many startups. How
Yeah,
do
some
startup board
I've rolled off.
meetings?
I've rolled off a lot of them now, because I'm writing smaller checks and it doesn't make as much sense. But yeah, I still sit on a couple boards. Um, I mean, look, most board meetings are pretty god awful and they're not run very well, right? Like I think what ends up happening is these board meetings just become like reporting meetings. And I'm like, I can read the report. Like they're better off if they're structured where it's like, okay, like giving board, give your board member homework, right? Like I need you to go and do this, or like make it sort of partially reporting where it's like, but really have them to sort of like use your board meet, like use your board members to get feedback, right? Use your board members. A lot of them have great experience where it's like, I'm trying to get to this decision. What do you think about this? I want to do this, but I want your opinion about this, right? Like use your board members. But a lot of
I
them just turn
understand.
into reporting
And
meetings, and that's a waste of time.
hmm. Do you have any startup in your portfolio, past portfolio, that successfully pivoted into a creative way that make you surprised?
I don't know if I see like almost every company that I see does some pivot, but they're usually not like dramatically big pivots, right? They're usually still focusing on sort of like the core market, or what ends up happening is that they end up pivoting, maybe same product but pivoting into sort of like a potentially larger, or sort of like a market that sort of has a bigger pain. So in general, like almost all of them pivot, but they're usually not dramatic pivots where it's like, oh, we're going from B to B, now we're going to B to C, right? Like that's a very big pivot. I usually have not seen that.
Uh, just in recent question, you answered that also with the red flags. Have you ever passed on investing in startup solely because of you? I mean, you didn't think the market opportunity was big enough, even if you liked the founder.
Yeah, all the time. And but it's just so hard, right? Because like I said, knowing that they pivot, and so it is a really hard conversation, so, like discussions as you're thinking through this where it's like, wow, this founder's so awesome, but like I just don't, like I'm in the process right now where it's like it's a previous founder, very successful founder, like, and good, very close friend. I think so highly of them, but just the market that they're going after, where I'm just like, I know this market, like what am I missing here? That is just like, I just don't see that this could be a good, like a, I think it could be a good business. I just don't think it'll be a big sort of like, a big massive business. Does that make sense? Where it's just I'm very convinced. Like I could see you getting to 10 million a year in business. I don't see you, maybe getting to 50 million a year. I don't see anything bigger than that. Not from what I know, right? And so, for example, it's in the Martech ad tech space, which I know super well. I'm just like, I just don't see where this goes in the long term, right? For knowing sort of like what the return profile for my money. I'm like, I'm very convinced that you're going to build a great business out of this, like a good business. I'm just not convinced this is sort of like a venture scale business. And so, yeah, that's a hard, like this is literally live. Like this week, I'm like pondering, right? Where I'm just like, do I do this? And my gut is probably no. Even though I love them, I love the founder to death.
If you don't know the vertical or the industry, what are the three questions that you ask to the founders?
One of the big questions is really sort of like, it's less about market size, but it's more about the competitive landscape of just like who's a direct and indirect competition that helps you figure out what that market is, at least for me, right? At least to triangulate, like, could this be a big market or not? Or is this a potentially big market? And then it helps me with my research later on to go and dig in a little bit more deeply. That's probably the biggest question, right? Like, what's your direct and indirect competition, and tell me why. And then the big part is like, tell me why you're going to win. And another question is really about who their customer is.
And for example, you have worked in 500 startups more than 10 years, I think.
6 years, 6 years, 6 years.
6 years, 6 years.
Yeah, it felt like 10, but like 6 years.
I mean, acceleration programs such as Y Combinator, 500, Techstars have been, and many more, very popular in last decade. In your opinion, how have these types of programs evolved over time, and do we need acceleration programs now?
I mean, I think like YC still does a great job, right? I'm a big fan of Gary Tan in general. I think there's like there are a couple good programs. I think Pioneer's interesting, but the reality is that most of them are kind of obsolete now. I do think sort of the pandemic kind of wrecked a lot of these programs because most of them became virtual. And so I think the programs that are able to sort of like go live again, so YC is doing live again, and I think they're shrinking the classes. I think going back to basics are still valuable, right? Like being around other awesome founders, I think is really valuable. But I think most programs are kind of garbage right now, because most programs have gone down the route of really, their business model now is working with corporates or governments and getting paid by them. They're not investment programs, and so that changes the nature of these programs. And so I think
I
most
mean,
of
you
them,
have it.
and in Silicon Valley, I think it's also, I would argue, outside of YC and maybe like, I think what's AngelList's program? AngelList has a related program that's not bad either. But just like outside of those ones, maybe Pair VC, I think most programs are probably not worth doing, because I think most that we have enough of there's just enough best practices out there. There's lots of masterminds. I think just naturally you're seeing a lot of like second time, third time founders. There's just a lot of expertise right now. So I think the original role that these accelerators actually provided, it's just less important now. So I think it's a much more mature ecosystem, and in a mature ecosystem, accelerators become much less important in general.
And I think there are lots of content nowadays, because when it was more 10 years ago, the content
Different beast.
hasn't been. Yes, I mean, today it can be found everywhere. I mean, on YouTube and from
I mean, the part that
lots of blogs.
The part, and mentorship is pretty much everywhere now. I think the biggest thing that accelerators can provide is really the community piece. And you're seeing people like On Deck do a pretty good job of sort of like building community of founders and great founders. You're seeing masterminds, right? Like that's become a thing now. So I think like the role of accelerators is still important, but just not as important as it used to be.
I think you have invested hundreds of startups, 400, 500, I don't know the exact number.
I'm at about 463 as of now.
What are the common patterns or traits have you seen the most successful founders?
They're just, they have a great understanding of the customer base, but like they're very mission oriented, right? We talk a lot about this. So we're just like, they're just going to work on this thing, like with or without your money. Right. And so, and just like they're relentless, they're just like really, really good. They're learning machines. Like they're smart, but also humble at the same time. One of the traits I just can't stand is like arrogant founders who think they know everything. I think there's a big difference being confident and being arrogant, right? Whereas like you can be confident, but like, do you still sort of like, are you a truth seeker, right? In the sense of, when I say truth seeking, of like, hey, I'm trying to get to the best decision. So I want to go and understand sort of other people's perspectives, versus like, I know everything. Like, you don't need, like, those founders just never last.
And so what is the biggest mistakes that these kinds of first time founders make?
They don't ask for advice, and not to say you have to take the advice, right? But I think it's ultimately sort of like they don't leverage their investors, or they look at their investors as sort of like more of a. So I'll give you an example. Like, I think a good founder, like they're very, very good about like updating you, right? Good news, bad news, are sort of like really good about updates, versus sort of like most founders are like, they only update you when things are good and they just disappear. Like, and this is usually most guys, where like it's usually guy founders where when things are not good, you never hear from them because they're just embarrassed, right? And I'm like, I'm not going to judge you by like bad news, right? Like, just tell me what's going on. Like, don't surprise me, right? Like, good things, bad stuff doesn't matter. Like, we're here to help you, right? Like, and so leverage us. Where like for me, it pisses me off when a founder tells me, "Oh, we're just shutting down," and I'm like, "What?" Like, out of the blue, like this could have been headed off like 6 months, because most likely you were already having problems like 6 months or 9 months ago, and you just didn't have the courage to come and reach out. Like, I'm not going to yell at you. Like, we're here to help you, right? Like, we're here as a resource. We're your partner to help you out in your business. Like, share with us good stuff. Great. Share with us bad stuff. Like, let's troubleshoot, right? Like, ask for help. And so I think the good founders, usually female founders, are pretty good about asking for help. Where it's like, I have this issue, like, let's talk through it. Great. Let's jump on a call and talk through it. That's what I like to see.
I see. And what kind of industries do you think that, I mean, of course, AI and machine learning and deep tech has been completely different in a couple of years' time. What industry trends do you see that it will grow in upcoming years?
I mean, I'm still a believer in general of sort of like the low code, no code stuff, which I would argue is also maybe like the developer tool set. I'm investing a lot of developer tools, still really needed, right? Because ultimately, if you think about it, sort of like what are the what are the products and tools that are going to be used by people. And so I do, as you know, I do way more B2B stuff now, because the space that, adoption of from SMBs or large companies of technology is still relatively low, right? So it's just like there's still a lot more room for adoption of tools, like outside of AI tools. Like I'm just talking in general, like basic cloud services. Most large companies are still not using cloud services. A lot of software is still on-prem, right? I think this growing sort of like solopreneur, growing sort of like SMB space, there's still lots of tools are still going to be used by them, right? There's glowing influencer class. Like there's just so many new sort of like businesses and that are sort of like growing, and they're all going to need to use products like software products, right? To sort of like, because software is leverage, right? Allows them to sort of like, instead of people doing it, you're using technology. So there's still lots and lots of room for growth there. So I'm still looking at these type of products.
If you have been super character or in Marvel stories, who should you be, and what should your superpowers be today?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I was Tony Stark. So just being super smart, right? I wish I was him, or maybe or maybe using Batman, where like I'd love to be Batman. These are just like normal people doing sort of like extraordinary things, right? So I feel like that's sort of the big thing of just like being super. I wish I was like that, like super smart and helps to be super rich. Both of them happen to be super rich.
What is your superpower, by the way?
Hmm. I think I'm pretty good at digesting information, and I think I'm a fairly direct communicator. You know my reputation. Not all my companies like or love me, but I do think sort of I'm pretty good at sort of like at least trying to be helpful, from like at least trying to tell the truth, because I think so many investors don't tell the truth, and that's an issue, right? Like that is a legitimate criticism of most of Silicon Valley, or just like most investors. They're not honest, and I think most investors, like, they believe it, like I'm a believer of sort of founder friendliness, but I think they think about founder friendliness in the wrong way. Like for them, it's just like, I'm your cheerleader, and I'm like, no, like that's part of the job as an investor, to be your cheerleader, right? But I think part of your job is also telling the founders, like when you think they're doing something wrong, or they're going the wrong direction, or they're not facing the reality, where it's like the and I've been having so many of these hard conversations, particularly this last year, almost 2 years now, of telling founders where it's like, hey, your burn rate is out of control. What are you doing? This doesn't make any sense. And ultimately they don't have to listen to me, but like having those hard conversations where it's like, okay, should you be fundraising? Maybe you shouldn't be fundraising, or maybe you should be doing this instead, because I've been doing this for a long time, right? And having those hard conversations, most investors either don't know what they're doing, or if they do know what they're doing, but they don't want to offend the founder, but then that's not good for the founder in the long run. So I actually think, I don't know if that's my superpower, but not all my founders like me, because of just like, I'm willing to have that hard conversation, and challenge them, right? Like that's actually your job.
So, how to become a brutal mentor? What is your secret sauce
I,
there?
I mean, I mean, ultimately, it has to be like, are you trying to do the right thing for, like, look, I will, most of these companies will not work out. I know that that's a game, right? But are you ultimately trying to do the right thing for them and for the business? I'm brutal. At least I think I'm brutal, not because I want to be an asshole. I think I'm brutal because I ultimately sort of like, I care about them and the business, right? And I have told companies where it's like, just shut it down, right? Like, what are you doing? This makes no sense. Just shut it down, right? Yes, I'm going to lose all my money, but whatever, right? Like, I know the game, but like, you're going to lose your time, and there's no, ultimately, sort of for where the business is at right now, there's probably no future. Just shut it down. And so I'm willing to have those conversations, because ultimately it comes from, at least I think I'm trying to do sort of like right by them, and so it has to come from
Uh,
doing right by them.
and reverse, if you could pick a person to be your mentor, who would it be?
I don't know. I mean, I've been pretty lucky already with my mentors, right? In general. So like remember, some of my mentors are virtual, right? Where it's just like, oh, like, whether they're some of them are dead, right, or the books that I read, or some of them are just like virtually from listening to interviews and stuff with them. Like probably Charlie Munger. I think he's like one of the smartest dudes around. So unfortunately he's passed away. But I've read all, I'm reading all his books and stuff, and I've read, Poor Charlie's Almanac, and I've listened to his interviews, and so I feel like you can get mentorship without sort of like having them. But I've also been very, very lucky. Sort of, I'm in a bunch of great masterminds. I've had a lot of great VC mentors, and so I'm pretty happy with sort of who I have as sort of like mentors right now, both virtual, dead or alive, as well as sort of like live mentors. So yeah, I've been lucky so far.
So I know that you are reading lots of books and also listening lots of podcasts. Any recommendations for startups and entrepreneurs?
I think like in general, there's just so many great things out there. So I'm a big fan of David Senra's like founders. I invest like the best. Patrick O'Shaughnessy's like unbelievable. I'm a big fan of 20 Minute VC. So Harry's a friend. He's awesome. So there's so many great podcasts out there. There's so many amazing podcasts out there. I recommend sort of like listening to these podcasts. Are all good. I also like Turpentine VC. At least as an investor, I get a lot of value from Eric Turnberg. Does a great job of interviewing like great VCs in general. So many great resources out there, but so many awesome books. Like I actually think like listen to the podcast, read the blog post, but like actually go and honestly just go read books.
Marvin, thank you very much. It was a always pleasure to talk with you and great conversation. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me.